Okay, we should be recording now. So, welcome to week two of Geomancy, Forgotten Divination of the Western Magical Tradition. Um, in this week, we're going to be talking about the history of Western magic and geomancy. And there's some kind of sensitive things to talk about here at the beginning, and some just important things to understand as far as like what we mean when we talk about this. But basically, we're going to go over what do I mean when I say Western magic or Western magical tradition. We're going to talk about the three great powers of the classical period: Egypt, Greece, and Persia, and how they became a melting pot. We're going to talk about the rise and fall of magic in Islam, and then we're going to talk about magic in Europe. And so that's going to kind of be the overarching history that we're going to look at. And it's important, as I mentioned last week, geomancy doesn't really start until the Arabic period and under Islam. And so would half your points happen before that happens? And the reason I do that is because it's important to understand the context that I'm referencing, right? And the context that this grew up in, and how it's connected into, and how it has influenced and been influenced by all the other ideas that were circulating at those times. So just something short that I wanted to read, and it's an important note, just because we've been talking a lot lately in society about history, about the sins of our ancestors and all of that kind of stuff, and what's been going on. And one of the things that's come up repeatedly is cultural appropriation, and when is it okay to borrow from another culture and all that kind of stuff. And so these are just kind of my thoughts on some of that. There's a lot more to be said, but I just wanted to highlight that it is something that I'm sensitive to, and I am not trying to be judgmental or to minimize any culture as we talk about this. So it's important that we recognize the ways that we learn from the mistakes and successes of our ancestors. It is also important that we acknowledge our ancestors' successes and achievements. So, side note, it's important that we have a balance. We can see the good and the bad. One of the issues we're forced to grapple with in discussions of history are ideas that are harmful. We cannot ignore these ideas, or they may resurface, rebranded and popularized. We are obligated to denounce them as what they are, which is evil. But we must also acknowledge that they played a part in the history of all peoples, and we still live with the consequences of those actions. Every history is incomplete. Therefore, we must acknowledge that every version of it is meant to tell a story suiting the purposes of the storyteller. So in this instance, I'm the storyteller, and what do I mean by all of that? So all of these cultures that we're going to be talking about, especially in the first half, practiced slavery. All of these cultures had sacrifices of different kind that some of them by today's standards would definitely be seen as evil. None of that is meant to excuse it or to justify it. That's not something I would ever attempt to do. Rather, just to understand this is the history, and this is where we came from as a people, and that doesn't mean we have to revert to it, right? And so I won't be talking a lot about slavery, and I won't be talking about some of the other social or cultural things that are less savory in this discussion, just because they don't suit my purpose as the storyteller. But just because they don't suit my purpose doesn't mean they weren't real and they don't matter. So I just kind of wanted to be upfront that I acknowledged that this is a thing, and I didn't want to glaze over it. So just a couple of notes. We'll be covering a little over 2,000 years of history, right? So this, and we're going to try to do it in an hour. So this is definitely not something that you should take as gospel by any means. I am not a memorizing dates type person. I can usually get the century plus or minus 100 years, right? So, so I'll be within the ballpark by about 300 years of when an event happened. Um, and so I do have all the dates and can go back and look at those, but most people don't remember things that way, or at least that's what I've found from the feedback of other classes that I've taught. So I left out specific dates as much as I could in the interest of telling a story. So that's my historical note number one. Historical note number two, science and magic were not consistently seen as separate things during these time periods. So astrology in particular was seen as a science right up through the Enlightenment. And what we'll see is how important astrology was to magic at the time in a lot of the arguments that came up towards the end of the medieval period. And so that's an important point I want to bring up. And then the last thing is I do my best to present the ideas in the cultural context they had at the time, not trying to do a lot of revisionist work. And I'm not trying to paint anybody out to be better or worse than they are. I try to just accept them on their own terms. So just felt that was important to get out of the way up front. Was there any questions about the historical context or any of that? Okay. Okay, so what do I mean by Western magical tradition? Well, what is the West? And this is kind of a charged topic because it's used a lot in modern parlance to mean white people or to mean Europe or to mean wealthy people. It's to, you'll hear it in some circles associated with Anglo-Saxon ideals, and that is not what I mean by that term at all. In the traditional sense, in the academic sense, the West is any culture that can trace its roots back to ancient Greece and Rome. Now, that basically means that for, I mean, I can't think of a culture that currently exists that is not influenced by the ideas of ancient Greece. If they have made contact with the internet, they have found ancient Greek ideas in their exchanges somehow. Now, it may be minuscule and to greater or lesser degrees. So what specifically do I mean by that? So this is going to be the a combination of culture, a combination of politics, a combination of language. All of these things are going to be influenced. Influences are, all of those things are going to be contributing influences to what I call the West. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, the West is going to include Persia, it's going to include Egypt and Northern Africa, it's going to include Arabia, and it's going to include Europe. So I'm taking a broad view of the West for this time period. And I do that because from a magical perspective, these are the centers of magic and intellectual thought at those times. There wasn't a huge exchange going on with India and with China and some of the other large powers of the day. And so that's why they get kind of omitted. And I'm kind of sectioning them off as the East. There's no term I could find that wasn't problematic to describe this, right? Because I didn't want to say European, because then I've pretty much ignored all the African and Arabic contributions to this, and I didn't want to call it Christian because, good Lord, there's like the 90% of this happens before Christianity gets involved. So, so I chose the term the West, and so that's meant to talk about that. So when most of us, I imagine, who are taking this course are what the part of Western magic we're familiar with are going to be like the grimoires of the medieval period, where we start getting a lot of Christian symbolism and a lot of Hebrew symbolism, and we're going to get a lot of like spirits, angels, demons, that kind of thing. And also and then into more the scientific realms like Agrippa and some of the others. So if you're coming out of that tradition, that's the tradition I'm talking about. But it's important for me to it's important for us to understand how that isn't limited to those pockets of Europe that we're familiar with, and how it was influenced from outside of there. So that's what I mean by the West as I'm talking through this. Any questions before we continue? Okay. All right. So Hellenization is like the most important thing that happened, in my opinion, to and it's one of the things Europe has most benefited from. So Alexander the Great, if you're not familiar, he became king of Macedon and Greece. Macedon was this area, appeared just to the north of Greece, which is down here. And his father had actually conquered Greece. And after his father's death, he pretty much went on a conquering spree, conquering all of Anatolia, what is modern day Turkey, conquering Egypt, or as it existed at the time, and then up into what was known as Persia. And the Persian Empire was huge. And he conquered Babylon, and then kept continuing right up to and into the borders of India. And at the height, he claimed to have conquered India. What we can tell historically and archaeologically is that, yeah, he stepped foot in India, and he definitely conquered some people in India, but it's not fair to really say that he conquered India. But anyway, so he captured this. And the result of this is he brought Greek language, and therefore Greek philosophy and Greek ideals, into those areas. And of course, there's always an exchange. Then he brought their ideas, the Persian ideas and the Egyptian ideas, back to Greece. And he is responsible for the beginning of the Hellenic period, or the Hellenization period, the Hellenization of the known world, as it's sometimes called. Now, after his death, for a lot of reasons that I won't go into, we end up with all of these different successor states, is what they're called. And so Egypt was ruled by one of Alexander's generals called Ptolemy. If you've studied any Egyptology, you'll remember the Ptolemaic dynasty. These were Greeks who ascended to the pharaohship after Alexander died. You have Greece still controlling much of what is today Turkey. And then you have lots of other states. We don't need to get into too much of them, but the important thing is they all continue to use Greek as an international language. Greek, we have the phrase lingua franca in modern parlance, and that's because French franca was the language that was used in international communication at one time. Before that, Greek was the international language. And so this is kind of the world that he left behind. And what we have with Ptolemy in particular and his successors was, and I'll dive into this a little bit deeper here in a minute, but one of his goals was to syncretize Greek ideas and Egyptian ideas. Everybody in Greece thought Egypt was the land of magic. It was the land that had all of the knowledge at one time. Now, because of their own politics and all that stuff, and again, this is the view outside of Egypt. So Egypt was this very magical land and all that stuff. It was the exotic land. And so what he's trying to do is basically rediscover all of this ancient knowledge and magic of the priesthood and mesh it with Greek culture and philosophy and what they understood. And so that's just the really important area to call out, with, of course, then the connections that they had with Babylon. That was the center of learning at the time. And so the exchange of ideas that opened up from having these now these nations, for lack of a better word, all having a shared language to communicate really changed the world in a lot of ways as far as the history of ideas. So the next big thing that happens is Rome. And Rome, and I'm glossing over history a lot here, Rome basically looked at Greek culture and said, yeah, that'll do, right? And they did a lot of their own synchronization back to Greece. And they corresponded and basically created a state religion that adopted all of the old Greek myths just with Roman names. And so getting into the study of ancient Rome gets complicated because, especially with their deities, because we'll end up with things like two Chronos deities. So there's Chronos, the father of Zeus, right? Or is Chronos the father of? Yeah, Chronos is the father of Zeus, and that's all well and good. But then there's a Roman Chronos who is the god of time, and they were not the same deity. But they get conflated, and this is how we get the Father Time Saturn image later on. So again, like these ideas getting exchanged and melded together is just a constant part of this ancient history. And so I just wanted to just highlight one example of that. So one of the big things is, as you'll see with Rome, they didn't go as far to the west. They did conquer Babylon, at least the city of Babylon, but not all of the old Persian territory. But they went much further to the west. They conquered all of France, what was called Gaul, and all down into what is today Spain and most of northern Africa, and basically created the empire of the Mediterranean, right? And this is, again, in the Roman Empire, Greek is the lingua franca. It is the language that they used for everyday common parlance. And you have studied the Bible at all, you'll know that the New Testament, which was written during this period, in fact, this is pretty accurate map of what the world looked like at the time of Jesus. It's not too far off. Jerusalem is right down here. It's all written in Greek, and it was written in Greek because they wanted it to spread and get to other people. They didn't write it in the local language because only people at that location would ever read it. They wrote it in Greek to get it widespread. And so again, just kind of the melting pot of ideas. And so this is where we start to see a lot of the ideas that had been brought up in Alexandria, in Babylon, and in Greece finally penetrate up into France, up into Britain, and down into Spain. Because before that, they didn't have contact with it. So it was, as much as I will denigrate Rome in other conversations, Rome is responsible for exposing my ancestors to higher learning. Okay, and so what did this actually look like? So what we end up with, I mentioned I would dive deeper into this in a minute. What we get with Alexandria, which is just one of many Alexandrias that Alexander the Great set up, it was the de facto capital of Egypt at the time. And what we see is the intentional synchronization of ideas. We'll see Greek and Egyptian deities correlated, same with the Persian deities. And we see even attempts to correlate some of the Germanic tribes and their gods with the Egyptian and Greek gods. So this is one of those things where it gets really interesting because there is one of the most famous ones is Thoth and Hermes, right? Where Thoth and Hermes are actually the same god, just two different names for him. Thoth being the Egyptian and Hermes being the Greek, Mercury being the Roman. And then we'll see them incorporate that into some of the Germanic stuff as they got exposed to it. So we see the results basically come out of this are an attempt to reconcile the different schools of philosophy. And these were mainly three big schools, two from Greek and one that we're not really positive where it came from. And those three schools are the Platonic school, which of course Plato and Socrates are responsible for, the Aristotelian school, and then the third is the Hermetic school. And this is the semi-mythical figure, Hermes Trismegistus. And the problem is we don't have any manuscripts left surviving from that philosophical school. What we have are quotations in other manuscripts of those manuscripts. And so we can piece together some of what their philosophy was, but a lot of it is missing for us. And so whenever you hear someone talk about being a Hermetic teacher, I always look at them with a jaundiced eye because I want to know what their sources are. Are they, because there is legitimate information out there, but so much of it is a reconstruction based on what other people were talking about, not what the actual original thinkers were saying, if that makes sense. So, but they were trying to reconcile these three schools and other minor schools. But out of this period, we get the Greek magical papyri, which if you've not dived into, basically has all of the prototypes, all of the archetypes for what we'll see practiced in the later grimoires. The use of names, the use of layman's, the use of so many of the tools, all can be found in the PGM. PGM is short for Greek magical papyri, and it's the Latin abbreviation for it. But so that's kind of the sources we, that's kind of the product that we see. So if you ever want to go to that, go study more, like just reading through the Greco-magical papyri and looking for parallels to the way they did things versus the way you'll see things done in the later grimoires is really eye-opening. And then the other big thing we get out of it is Hellenic or traditional astrology. And so this is kind of a modern reconstructionist movement to go back and look at what astrologers from these ancient time periods were saying. So one of the challenges we get to in talking about astrology, and I mentioned this before the class, this is a repeat for some people, but in modern astrology, we see things like reincarnation and past lives and lots of concepts like that are not historically accurate to the time that astrology started, right? So Greeks kind of maybe in some cults had an idea of reincarnation, but certainly by the time we get into medieval Europe, there was no reincarnation, right? So it's important to understand where these different ideas have blended, right? And modern astrology is just a continuation of this blending of ideas and this drawing in stuff from different sources. So I'm not trying to denigrate it at all, but the modern movement of Hellenic or traditional astrology is meant to go back, and this started in the 90s with Project Hindsight, where they went back and they translated a bunch of the old manuscripts on astrology, and it was done by astrologers to basically understand what the original techniques and methods were. And so reading those sources that they have sheds a ton of light on, and we see them even into like the 9th and 10th centuries in Arabia, arguing about a Hermetic understanding of astrology versus an Aristotelian understanding of astrology. And there's so this tradition continues well into the medieval period. Um, and we start to see this syncretizing of religions. So I kind of mentioned this, but I wanted to call out. I'm sorry. Actually, let me back up. So one of the things that we see in astrology, because I do want to dive into this for just a minute. What you'll see with astrology from this period is in Greek astrology, you had the 12 signs and 12 houses. But the 12 signs probably came from Persia originally, not from Greece. There's a pretty good argument to be made that they originally came from Persia in that understanding. But then if you've ever dug into astrology and you've gone into what are called the faces or the decans, and there's 36 of them, 3 for each sign, those come directly from Egypt. And so Egypt didn't have 12 signs, they had 36. And each one was ruled slightly differently. And so what we get out of that period is the foundation of modern astrology, where the signs, the decans, the houses, the planets all start to mean the same thing, and we get a system out of it. So much of what modern astrology is based on ties directly back to that period. So that specific one, just to highlight the 3 big powers of the signs coming from Persia, the planets being universal, and then the decans coming from Egypt. And then, of course, there's the terms and bounds idea as well, is an Egyptian idea. So there's lots of different levels of this. When you get into astrology, you'll see the cultures influence each other really obviously. But then we start to get syncretic religions. So what we'll see is this guy down here in the bottom right corner. And so just to highlight, and I haven't been commenting too much on the pictures, but this is just a snippet of one of the pages of the magical papyri. This, and I've forgotten the name of it. It's in the Louvre. It's the ceiling of a temple, and it starts with a D. It's not Delta. It's like Deidre or something like that. Anyway, I can look it up later and add it to the notes. But this is an astrological chart that was carved into the ceiling of a temple in ancient Egypt, and is now in the Louvre. And then this guy down here, syncretic religions, is Serapis. And Serapis is 100% a god we know was made up by men. They didn't try to hide it. They were like, okay, we need a god that can bridge the Greek pantheon and the Egyptian pantheon, because this 1-to-1 ratio sometimes worked, but sometimes doesn't. The gods in Egypt behave very different than the gods behaved in Greece. So Serapis was this god that they created, and was an attempt to unify these pantheons and to explain some of the differences between them. So it's really interesting if you ever want to start reading about him and how he was used. And we see him, of course, referenced in the magical papyri. But not just clear examples of syncretic religions like Serapis, but we start to see ideas in ancient Judaism change, for example. So up until the oldest books of the Bible, when they talk about dying, they talk about basically the grave, right? There's no real afterlife so much as like your soul traveling on, because they didn't necessarily believe in a soul. They had a concept of the breath of life, and the breath of life would leave you, but there's nothing specific to you involved in that breath, right? There's nothing personal about it. Just living beings have the breath, and inanimate beings do not. And so in the oldest Hebrew scriptures, this is kind of how death is treated. Now, there was this concept of a resurrection where God would eventually restore the world to perfection, and he would bodily raise everyone from the dead. And so it's not that you got a new body as we get, or a new soul or anything like that you get in the later New Testament. This was very much your old body was restoring. This is why proper burial was so important. And we start to see that going into the later books, like the book of Daniel. But by the time of Jesus, we start, what we start getting into is some of the concept. And there's this whole debate in the Christian community about what Jesus believed about the afterlife, whether he was a more traditionalist or whether he was part of this later group. But as Judaism, it happened first in Judaism, of course, and then we really see it in Christianity, which is why I call it in particular is in the original Hebrew version, you get raised from the dead whether you're good or bad. There was no justice to it at all, right? It's just if you were one of God's people, you got raised from the dead. And what they started to get into, we start to see is these concepts of so I'm going to set that aside. Then in the Greek world, they're dealing with the problem of there's just Hades and everybody goes there and everybody lives there and it's not that great. And when we see like Plato and Socrates talk about people in Hades, even the ones that are supposed to be in like the good place, they're shades, they're empty husks, right? They're not who they really used to be. They're like the echoes of the lives they had. But as these ideas develop and this concept of a soul comes out of the Platonic school, it's like, well, if we've got this soul, what happens to it when you die? And we start to see a lot of ideas of instead of just like the going to sleep and waiting for the resurrection of the ancient Hebrews, we start to see ideas creep up into Judaism of an afterlife or a waiting period. And then the same thing happens in Christianity, where instead of destruction being the cause or being the result of living an evil life and eternity in paradise being the reward, what we start to see is that no, there's a place of eternal punishment because your soul can't be destroyed, and so it has to go somewhere. And so this is we start to see all of these ideas blend in, and this is why Christianity, especially as it was practiced in the early we'll call it the post-Roman period, was very, very much a syncretic religion. And this is why we get Jesus's birthday on the winter solstice and John the Baptist on the summer solstice, and why we get so many pagan days co-opted into Christianity is because they were coming out of the spirit of syncretism, where there's one religion and we just have to figure out how it applies to this area. So any questions on the Egyptian melting pot or any of the points that I brought up? Okay, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I don't know anything about the Greek magical papyri. Can you talk a little bit more and how it connects to whatever the other thing was you said?
Yeah, so the Greek magical papyri is a collection of scrolls. It's called the PGM, and I'm going to refer to it as the PGM. And that's just because in Latin it's papyri magica Graecae or something like that. I'm not skilled at Latin by any means, but PGM is how it's abbreviated. And basically it is a collection, it is a magician's notebook. It is a collection of the spells and the rituals that he was doing, the talismans he was creating, even down to like personalized talismans. So I can't remember the specific names, but like, let's say someone came to him and her name was Vanessa. So he writes out how he created a talisman for the name Vanessa, right? And to specifically protect this person, right? So it is useful in that it shows how a magician, it's an example of how a magician was working at that time, how magic was being practiced by a real person at that time. So this person could afford ink, this person could afford paper or papyrus, he wasn't just some swindler, right? And he was documenting it. So he we can make certain levels of assumptions about how educated he was and all this stuff. and he's working out of multiple languages and combining multiple symbols, right? So he had to have had some kind of an education, um, uh, whether formal or informal. And so it's digging into those. What we'll see is like the idea of, so one of the things you'll see in the grimoires a lot is creating what is called a layman, and most of the time this is just like a piece of parchment. In the medieval grimoires it was parchment that you've written out sacred names of God on, and certain symbols and stuff like that, right? And you would basically wear it around your neck when you went into a ritual to either evoke a spirit or to do whatever it was you were trying to do. And this was your primary protection piece. We see those same practices in the PGM, right? Which is, in some cases, over 1,000 years before that, right? So the fact that we see some of these same techniques 1,000 years apart shows that there clearly wasn't an unbroken tradition by any means, but there's definitely a continuity between this period and the medieval grimoire period. Does that make sense, and why that's important to bring up there?
Yeah, so it's kind of where sigils came from?
So it depends what you mean by sigils. Yes, they do have some sigilization stuff in there, but it's not, they never give instructions on sigils. The sigils they would like much more like what's pictured. Like it would be a man with the head of, I don't know if this is supposed to be a dragon or a donkey, holding two thryses, clothed in a legionnaire's tunic or something like that, with these letters written on. So they would be images as opposed to sigils. Okay. So like, I can't remember now, and it's just been too long since I've read them, but it's when you get into the PGM. So with sigilization in the medieval period, they're using a lot of tables that were usually Hebrew, with the Hebrew alphabet spread across the tables, and you spelled out your word to create your sigil, right? I don't remember that being in the PGM, but that doesn't mean it isn't. That's down to my memory. I'd have to go do the research.
Do we know who the magician was?
I don't believe so. And we're not even sure. Like, and like it's a relatively recent discovery. I would have to look it up to tell you for certain, and I can get that for you. But I want to say we've only had it for about 100 years or so. So our understanding of it and the amount that we've studied it is pretty thin. But that hasn't stopped people from publishing a lot about it. Stephen Skinner, who is he's definitely not perfect, but he's one of the best writers, coming from a historical and from an academic background. So he is a PhD in languages, if I remember right. He has written a book called Greco-Egyptian Magic, which basically goes into, that's not the full name. Give me 2 seconds and I'll get you the full name. It's called Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic. And in that book, I've got it somewhere. I just didn't have it ready because
don't worry about it.
I didn't expect it. So it's somewhere around here. But Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic. And in it, basically what he does is he looks at the PGM and organizes it, because this was very much a workbook for this guy, right? So he didn't start and like, in this section, I'm going to talk about love spells. In this section, I'm going to talk. He was like, someone came to him and needed a spell. He wrote out how he was going to do it or how he did it, and moved on. So like you'll get a protection spell and a love spell and then a invocation to a god, like right next to each other, to the point where it doesn't necessarily make sense. And then maybe he learns something, and so later on he'll like make some notes about something that he should have done in a previous, like it's a very complex manuscript or document. So anyway, it's
So
fascinating.
Skinner puts it in order. Skinner makes it make sense.
So one of the things that is a criticism of Skinner is he is not writing books for the general audience. What he is not trying to, we talked about John Michael Greer. John Michael Greer very much tries to write it for your average person to read it and understand it and does lots of explanations. Skinner does not do that. He is assuming you have certain levels of knowledge before you ever approach this. What he does is he takes it and rather than just record it as it exists in a straight line, just start at the top, he takes out all the parts and groups them together. So he groups all the love spells together and all of this type of spell together and shows the similarities and patterns and that type of stuff. So that's why I said he's not perfect by any means. And and he does have critics to his scholarship as well. But I happen to be a big fan of him. He also wrote one of the books that he wrote, two of the books, I think, that are in the bibliography for this class. He wrote Geomancy, or I've got it right here, hold on. Geomancy in Theory and Practice. And then he wrote a book called Oracles of Geomancy or something like that. It's out of print. Don't waste your money getting it. It's not that great. In Geomancy in Theory and Practice is a much better book. But again, he spends a lot of time on history and does not go very much into the technique at all.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, you can get a translation of the PGM. Just don't expect it to be like, just understand it for what it is, which is one dude's workbook from 2,000 years ago, yeah, and not the secrets of the ages or anything like that.
Got it. Thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay. So the next section, the next big thing that happens, of course, and I'm glossing over, Rome declines. It spends a couple hundred years doing that. Christianity rises, especially up into Europe. But in Greece as well. And I say that Rome declines, but the Eastern Empire in Byzantium sticks around for a long time and shields Europe from a lot of the stuff going on in the East. But the next big thing that happens is Rome falls anywhere, depending on who you ask, in the 400s, 500s, somewhere in there. Some go as late as the 700s, but the next big culture to rise up is Islamic culture. And there are a couple of key features to Islamic culture that I want to point out here. One is early on, it was very, very pro-science. And it was definitely looking in mathematics. This is why, I'm sure some of you have heard this before, but why algebra and alchemy, these are all Arabic words that came into Europe, right? So from a scientific perspective, they leapt ahead of what the Roman Empire and what Europe had been doing up to that point. We talk about the names of the stars. A lot of the stars, especially a lot of the fixed stars we'll see, all have Arabic names. So think of Algol, which is the ghoul in Arabic, right? So a lot of science was done by this people. So it's thinking of our stereotype of them now versus their history is really a big challenge. And I want to be clear, that's what our stereotype of them is now is not what the reality of those people is now. Sure, there are some people who are backwards, just like there are some people in every country who are backwards. So I just want to throw that out there. But a big feature, so that was one big feature of them. So they're sitting here, of course, they've been exposed to Greek because they've been conquered by people who were so they're taking all that information and adding it to their own. But one of the big things for them was they were people of the book, and codified into their law was that, you know, basically, and I'm very much generalizing here, but basically at this time in the Islamic world, if you were a person of the book, you at least had certain guarantees of rights, right? So Muslims, people who followed the Quran, may have preferential treatment and in practice definitely more rights, but you weren't forced to convert if you were a Christian or a Jew in the Muslim world, right? And I say that because those two are the two most obvious people of the book, right? Because Islam comes from that Abrahamic tradition. But one of the other ones I really wanted to call out are the Sabaeans. And the Sabaeans were Southern Arabian in their, as far as like where they came up. They're actually mentioned in the Old Testament a couple times. And in the Arabic writings, they call them star worshippers. And what we see with these people is they had preserved at this point a lot of the astrology and a lot of that syncretic movement in the Muslim world. And I'll touch on that here in a minute. A little bit more. Yeah, I do come back to it. But they had, just a brief sketch out, they considered themselves people of the book because they followed Idris. And Idris is called Enoch in the Bible as we know it here in the English-speaking world. So they followed Idris, and they said his name was Hermes Trismegistus, is the other name you know him by. So we get from them this concept of astrology and some type of star worship mixed with the Hermetic tradition and with Enoch from the Bible. But because they had that Idris connection, the Muslims pretty much allowed them to continue practicing. Now, eventually, a period of unrest happened, and they were persecuted and, for all intents and purposes, wiped out. But they were, at least early on, allowed to continue. And there were lots of other smaller religions. So one of them that's dying out today is the Yazidis. They have a reputation for being devil worshippers, and they're not by any definition of the word, other than in their myths, Satan or the devil, whatever name you want to give him, was ordered. All of the angels were ordered to bow before humanity because humanity was given the place of pride in God's creation, and Satan refused, saying he would only bow to God. And for that sign of disobedience, even though it was also a sign of respect to God, he's like, I respect you too much to follow this order. He was cast out, but yet was seen also as the most beautiful and most rewarded. It's really complex, but there were lots of other religions, like I said, at this time that were tied in. Yazidi is one that just happens to be dying out today, thanks to the wars and genocides that are going on over there in that part of the world. So the last thing that was a big feature of Islam at this time is they had empires. So unlike what a lot of empires ended up, the reason they only grew so big was they only had claims to certain regions or certain types of people, ethnicities, or something like that. The Islam mandate is that you bring the word of God to the entire world. So they definitely, at this early period, saw it as their duty to conquer the world. And so just to kind of show that spread, and again, we're looking at that same area. So in this dark brown part, this is basically the world that was conquered by Muhammad, who of course is the prophet of Islam, right? So this is the world as it exists, or as he conquered it. Then we get basically 2 generations of caliphates, and that was basically the kingdom, for lack of a better word. It corresponds to a monarchy. for all intents and purposes. Um, so we get 2 doses of that, or 2 different dynasties, and it expands out, and we end up with Islam covering basically most of the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain is, all of northern Africa, all of Arabia, all of what is Persia, Iraq, Iran. These are the modern map borders. So this is Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, etc. Right. So these are the areas that were by 750 conquered by Islam. Right. And so it's in this period that geomancy starts. And geomancy, and so in this area, where now instead of Greek being the common language, Arabic is becoming the common language. And one of the features I talked about last week was in geomancy, everything goes right to left instead of left to right. Arabic writes right to left instead of left to right. It's a Semitic feature. A Semitic language group feature. So what we see is it started here. Now, one of the things, and I do just want to call this out, that we're not 100% sure on, is we see similar practices in other parts of Africa in the form of Ifa, and I believe I'm pronouncing it right when I say Sikiti or Sikiti. And these are done with nuts or stones, and it's a similar binary divination style practice. We don't know enough to know who influenced whom. Evidence seems pretty strong that the Arabics would have influenced the African traditions, but I don't want to say that as gospel. And we'll talk about why we think that is, aside from just writing right to left. So I touched on this briefly before. So Ilm al-Ramel was the Arabic word for this, and we see in Greek texts in like Byzantium and some other areas, they'll call geomancy, instead of using the Greek words geomancy, they'll call it like Rambalia or something like that, and that's all tying back to this Arabic word that means sand. And we talked about the dots in the sand last week and all of that stuff. Well, in Arabic culture, of course, it's like, well, it's not in the Quran. Why is this okay? And the arguments for it were several-fold. The first big one was the story that's told is that Idris, one day, who I've already mentioned is associated with the Old Testament prophet Enoch, is struggling with some decision. Doesn't matter what the decision is. And he stops and he leans against the tree, and it's the heat of the day, and he's in the shade, and he starts tapping out tapping his stick in the sand. And a man walks up to him, and this is basically what's wrong. And he says, and explains what his trouble is. And he says, well, I don't understand. You've written your answer out right here. And he's like, what do you mean? I've just been tapping my stick in the sand. And the man who came up to Idris reveals himself to be the angel Jibrail, which is the same angel who would later dictate the Quran to Muhammad. And Jibrail, and it's Gabriel in modern English. But Jibrail sat there and then explained how geomancy worked to Idris, right? And showed him how to get the answer to his problem from what he had already been doing. And then, according to the story, he traveled to India to teach them. And this is that part of the story has been confused, because what we'll see in a lot of texts, especially Arabic texts, is they'll say, well, this practice came from India. Because as I mentioned earlier, in the Greek culture, Egypt was the land of magic. And so they wanted to tie everything back to Egypt. Well, in Arabic culture, India was the land of magic. So if they wanted to find some way to they would cite it back to India. So they made him travel to India to teach them, so that later people who claim to teach it in India or to have learned it from India would have a reason for them to have known it. Now, side note, insofar as all of the research I've done, I can't find any reference to this type of practice in India anywhere. So this is why, you know, the oldest sources claim it came from India. We don't find any references in India for it. So take that for us. So, but the thing about this being this Jibreel and Idris connection is it's a double Muhammad connection. So Muhammad being the central prophet to Islam, Muhammad was a descendant of Idris. And then, of course, Jibreel dictated the Quran to Muhammad. So those two things combined definitely fit this myth into the Arabic context. So they definitely owned it from a mythological storytelling standpoint. And then we see it spread with the caliphate. So I mentioned the African traditions of Ifa and Sakiti. They are other possible sources for the inspiration, and we just really don't know. What we and then of course someone last week at some point mentioned the I Ching, right? Casting lots is kind of a human behavior, right? So we shouldn't just assume that just because two ideas are similar that they definitely arrived from the same point, right? So I do think that the I Ching is a similar concept that was discovered by a different culture. We don't have a ton of evidence for them having an exchange. We know they were aware of each other. We know they had some exchange through like the Silk Road and stuff like that, but we don't have any like that was the exchange of goods, which is separate from the exchange of ideas. And so we don't. I just wanted to touch on that, where there's lots of other possibilities, but Arabic definitely seems to be where this came from. One of the things that was a really important part of it was the 28 mansions of the moon. So when we get into some of the meanings for some of the symbols, and we'll say, why was this associated this way at this time, it's going to have to come back to the 28 mansions of the moon. I just wanted to throw that in there. And again, we see that going back to the oldest 28 mansions of the moon were really important in Islamic culture. And we see that being really important in the oldest examples of geomancy. And so just all ties into Arabic culture being the foundation for geomancy. Okay, so how does it spread into Europe? Now, you'll notice in that map I had up earlier about the spread of Islam, Islam spread into Europe. And that's pretty much how it spread in Europe. What we see is it's ironic, the oldest reference we have to geomancy as far as the term written down dates to about the 600s in Spain. And it's in a book, and it's listing out different types of divination, and is listed with hydromancy, pyromancy, aeromancy, and necromancy. Now, if you're any good with Greek, that's water divination, fire divination, air divination, and dead divination, or divination with the dead, right? So there's no description given for any of those types of divination or anything like that. And so likely, even though that's our oldest reference to the word, and it is in Spain, which would eventually get conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate, it's probably not the same geomancy that we're talking about coming from Arabia. More likely, it's the type of scrying that would be done by looking into a candle flame, or watching waterfall, or watching wind currents as it stirs leaves and trees, or something like that, right? And similarly, there's a kind of seismological divination that even Agrippa talks about in 3 books of occult philosophy, and that's probably what that geomancy is talking about, feeling, determining the truth from vibrations in the earth and stuff like that. And so that's our oldest reference, but our oldest manuscripts come from Spain. Spain 100% hands down has our oldest manuscripts, and they come from a period when Islam was the political authority. So that's, again, just more arguments for Islam at least being the carrier for geomancy, if not the originator. And then we see it into France. And the fact that we see it there first, as opposed to some of the German countries like Bavaria or Austria that are closer to the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which of course is still speaking Greek at that time, a different dialect, but still speaking Greek, is all indication that it came not from an ancient Greek source, but from a Muslim source, right? And the fact that it was even called something different by the Byzantine scholars shows that as far as its introduction into the West came, its introduction into Europe came from the West, not from the East. And so as we start seeing it in Spain and then France, and it pretty much very, very quickly takes off. One of the big early adapters is this guy here holding a jar of medicine, Gerard de Cremona. He developed one of the first ways, the first methods of doing geomancy to generate an astrological chart. And we will, in a later class, go over that method that he used. And what we start seeing is that the European scholars, magicians, scientists, whatever word we want to use to call them at this point, they all started, reading and adapting this, right? Because at the time, Arabic sources were they were the height of science. They were the height of knowledge. So they wanted to read anything they could get their hands on. So, and just again, bolstering that, if you've ever looked at the Picatrix, you understand the Picatrix is a book for carving images for magical purposes, for gemstones and rings and talismans and all that kind of stuff. It was originally in Arabic, and we can trace its history is very, very similar as far as how it spread and how those ideas spread. So the fact that its history and geomancy, again, all point to Arabic sources. Questions on how it got into Europe or any of the history that we've talked about so far? Oh, hold on.
There was...
I'm sorry, start over. What was that?
There was a picture of what looked like an angel a couple of slides back, and I was curious what that was.
Yeah, that was Jibreel.
Yeah.
So Arabic or Islam, as you may know, is very anti graven image. That you don't draw pictures of Muhammad, you don't draw pictures of all that stuff, and so finding Arabic art that depicts human beings or even mythological figures is a challenge. This happens to be one of the depictions of the angel Jibreel, and they would never depict, well, I shouldn't say they would never, because they have in different periods, but the general consensus of modern Islam is you do not ever create an image of a prophet. But this is a 14th century tapestry that has Enoch on it, and this comes from Byzantium, but this is not the tapestry, this is the fresco, this is a church wall. But anyway, this is I wanted to just show those two figures. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. So the big question, as far as the church was concerned, is it science, right? God rules science, and divination is outlawed, but science is okay. And this is how astrology survived, because astrology was considered science right up. I think I haven't checked in my post-Counter-Reformation sources, because I'm just not familiar with the church as well after that point. But right up at least until the Counter-Reformation, astrology was considered a science. and may still be in some ancient document in the Catholic Church still today. It was one of those quirks of history where no one went back and changed it. And so a big part of all of this comes down to demonstrating that geomancy is a science and not a divination. And what we see, and just to give two examples, are Albertus Magus and St. Thomas Aquinas. And this is St. Thomas Aquinas here on the right. And his argument was definitely pro-astrology. Astrology is the science that's closest to God. He was very much pro-astrology. And he also made the argument that God influences the casting of lots. God has that ability. That does not mean that every lot cast God has directly manipulated, but God does get involved. So he allows for geomancy very cautiously, Albertus Magus more positively. So he allows for geomancy, A, because it has an astrological connection, and which we haven't gone over too much yet, but we will. So they had to make an astrological connection, which they did, and God has influence over Catholic. But the problem was, if you were doing a divination to see, like, will I find my lost cow? That is not what geomancy is for. That is not what casting of lots is for. That is too mundane. That is too human. You only do geomancy for higher things. And so for spiritual things, right? And so that was the kind of, and this guy, of course, became a saint. So this is kind of the church view. And depending on location and time, the church really didn't bother too much with geomancy. In fact, different areas, the church was definitely part of geomancy. And we have references to priests doing and performing geomancy, right? Let's not forget that one of the patrons of Agrippa's was a bishop, right? So the church, while we have like the Inquisition versus the ordinary versus the College of Cardinals, we think of the church as a single body. In fact, it is a lot of different political bodies, all wrapped up in this tangle. So in this area where this political wing of the church is in charge, they might not care very much. Whereas over here in Aragon in the 1300s, man, the guy in charge of the Inquisition hates divination. And so if you get caught in that area, you're in trouble. And so that's kind of how we see that go. And so how does this tie into magic, though? Well, what we see are its use in sigils and characters. So here are two examples. This first one is taken, I'm not sure where it's originally taken from. I believe it's originally taken from Agrippa's 3 books, one of the editions, but I could be wrong. But this on the right is from a gentleman named Dr. Rudd, who is an Englishman who was writing in the, oh gosh, I've just forgotten the century. Doesn't matter. He was an Englishman. And both of them are using geomancy as an inspiration for creating different characters and sigils to be used in magic. They tied them into geomantic intelligences so that each figure had its own spirit, its own angel, its own intelligence that was over it. And then they were used for talismans and protection. And I think I see a question. So yeah, go ahead.
So some of the reading that I've been doing is about the sigils and the angels and the the angels and the spirit of the angels and the intelligence of the angels. That's it. Mm-hmm. Will you be talking about them at some point? Because it makes no sense. Because I have no understanding of that.
No, I don't get into it because I'm just talking about divination in this class and not about. I wasn't getting into invoking spirits or anything like that.
Right.
But we can maybe have a side conversation about that.
Okay.
That is that is very confusing. If you're depending what your introduction is to it, it can be really confusing.
No.
But yeah, so what we end up, there's angels over geomancy, and there's intelligence and all this stuff, and all of this ties into that Western magic tradition. And then again, we see it tied up in with the talismans of protection and all that kind of stuff, right? So
Got
this
it.
is that is kind of the how it gets incorporated. So I again in this session just wanted to talk about
History.
the
Got
history, right? We're not getting into the specifics. Okay, and then why did it go away? Well, a couple of things happened. Again, the church's view was divination is outlawed, but science is okay. And I mentioned 1300s, especially in Aragon, started to really ramp up its persecution of divination and astrology. But in other parts of Europe, we've got geomancers publishing and performing openly, and nobody is batting an eye. So again, this really comes down to the place. But the big nail in the coffin that happened was in 1550s. This one is published in 1564 in Venice, this image over here. But this is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. And this is basically the Catholic Church's big list of banned books. And what starts happening in the 1550s is the Catholic Church starts banning books on geomancy. And basically, it's a banned subject. You can't write it anymore. Agrippa gets added to the list. Several other people do. So that's happening. At the same time, we've got the College of Cardinals telling the Inquisition, hey, you guys are spending way too much time trying to root out divination and not focusing on heresy. And your job is to focus on heresy. So you focus on heresy and let the ordinary church, church and judges handle divination. And so we see kind of this battling between different parts of the church, where it's like this part of the church is going to put it on a banned list, and the Inquisition is really going after it. But then the College of Cardinals is coming out and saying, hey guys, chill on the divination stuff. Like, focus on heresy. That's your job. So, but those things are really what ramped up. And of course, at this period, England has officially split off and become Protestant is probably the wrong word, but a non-Catholic church. And so the church has those powers. So we start to see geomancy make a revival there. And this is why people like Thomas Flood and I just had his name up there earlier, Flood and Rudd. I always remember their names that way. But and they probably were pronounced Flood and Rude, but that's a completely separate thing. But we start seeing lots of geomancy stuff like that. And what we see in the royal geomancies of England, which had been going on, there'd been an interest in geomancy at the time, even before that. But what we see is these very ornate books that are very, very simplified for the royal court to use. And those are the types of manuscripts that they'll have in the 19th century, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So, but the big nail in the coffin for geomancy was first the Reformation, and then the Counter-Reformation, followed by the Enlightenment. So when you've got, we start having the Protestant princes and the Protestant states in the Holy Roman Empire and different areas, a lot of the old stuff like astrology and geomancy were banned, considered superstitious by the Reformation. And then, of course, the Counter-Reformation, an attempt to revise the Catholic Church and keep it around and keep it alive, started really persecuting a lot of those same practices. So basically, there was no quarter for these people to go. We see a little bit of a safe haven, like I said, in England. But by the time that drama quieted down, which we'll see in the 16 and 1700s, we start to see astrology make a peak back up, and I have in my head a world in which astrology makes a peak back up, and so does geomancy, and so do all of these other practices, and get combined with science. But instead, what happens is astrology makes a peak back up, and people immediately start rejecting it because we get the scientific method. We start getting calculus, and we start getting reliable, reproducible science in a way that we had never had it before, and that's the Enlightenment period. And so those things combined the death of it, or at least the dormancy of it. So the big question is what happened during the 19th century. So if you're familiar with history at all, you'll know that, in the 1800s, we start getting Golden Dawn, and a lot of these other magical groups start up. And magic, I say, I say went dormant. I would never say it died out. There was definitely still continued to be talked about and written about, but not nearly at the level it had been in the centuries leading up to this period. But what happened in the 19th century is we start to get a revival. And we have Golden Dawn first, several others. I say the Golden Dawn first. In fact, that's not even accurate. But we have several of these magical groups come up. Golden Dawn is just the one that's most famous. And they start to reconstruct or reimagine what this magical tradition was like. Now, they were definitely Christian influenced. They were definitely, which of course we've seen the Christian influence throughout this European history. They were definitely influenced by that. We see it with Elvis Levi and several other people. They work to reconstruct and to bring back these hidden secrets. Both the Golden Dawn and Crowley published, well, I shouldn't say the Golden Dawn published, Crowley published the Golden Dawn's work on geomancy. But it is crap. It is just a series of tables with simplistic answers. It does not have any of the depth of information that you get from other geomantic sources. And a big part of it is either he didn't have access to the manuscripts, or the manuscripts hadn't been, he didn't have access to the manuscripts is going to be my excuse I give him. I'm not the biggest fan of Crowley, but I also acknowledge the contribution that he and the Golden Dawn before him did to our vocation. So basically, it kind of got dropped by the 19th century. It never really got the treatment it deserved. Plus, tarot cards were really popular when they developed the tarot card system first with Rider-Waite-Smith, and then Crowley with his own system. Those were incredibly popular, and tarot has its own unique and convoluted history. But those became popular, and so there really wasn't a need for another geomantics or for another divination system, right? Because you had tarot cards. The problem with tarot cards is the worldview, the paradigm that's built into it is very much a Hebrew, a Christian-centric, Jesus saves paradigm, right? Because that is the paradigm to do it now. I know lots of modern tarot readers try to get away from that, but that is definitely at its foundation if you're using the Rider-Waite-Smith deck in particular. So anyway, that's why I feel like geomancy is a good alternative to that. And I can't believe that so there's another image that I meant to show. Give me just a second. I'm going to pause share for a minute. I may have closed out of it.
Is it science we didn't see?
Is it science?
Yeah, I didn't see that one, I don't think.
This one is St. Thomas Aquinas. There was another image, and it was the Thomas flood, and I apparently forgot to add it to the presentation. I apologize. I will post it.
Okay.
Oh, hold on. Let me start sharing again. We are still recording. Sorry about all that. Okay, so there's another image. It's from one of Thomas Flood's book, but it just shows the prevalence of geomancy at that time, right? Because it's right there considered with direct prophecy and astrology and all of these other sciences at the time. It was considered one of the spokes of the wheel. And I'll share that image separately because what geomancy became versus what it was considered at the time, at that specific time, is very, very different. So go ahead and open this up then to any other questions.
Is there a modern history, like, or do people just find it now? Like, you can find astrology anywhere. Is geomancy something you find because you're meant to find it, or is it something that's taught if you are learning magic, I guess?
Yeah, so short answer is there's the modern history is being written. As far as the two modern publishers that I would recommend, John Michael Greer, who we've mentioned, and Stephen Skinner, who I've mentioned, both write about it. Now, my criticism of Greer is he definitely has the techniques. He has some of the techniques down. He's got a lot of the information there. There's a couple of things that he doesn't explain, and because he doesn't explain it, makes me question whether he really understands it or whether he's just copying it out from a source, right? And that's not to say it's wrong. It's still useful just to have whatever source, but he doesn't often cite his sources. And so I can't go back and check and try to understand, right? So there's one section, and it's not a criticism of him at all, but it's later in the book where he basically just quotes a section of Agrippa, right? And it's word for word he's copying, and that's fine. He should probably ethically quote that, right? And but again, it's not like what he's saying there is any kind of revelation, right? So my point there is, it still hasn't received the level of scholarship that I think it needs. And there's no established school. Now, there are a couple of people who I know practice it online. Even some astrologers that are also magicians, I know, because an important thing to understand is not all astrologers are magicians. Neither are all magicians astrologers, but in the Venn diagram where those two intersect, quite a few of them will also practice divination. Because one of the reasons why it was so popular, and thank you for calling this out because it's definitely a section that I forgot to mention. One of the reasons this was so popular is because astrology was the king of sciences and of divination at the time, right? It was the main game going. But what we end up with is how do I use it to find out something like, will I find my lost cow, right? How do I answer that question? Well, the astrological technique for that is called horary.
Yeah.
Horary astrology, where you ask the question at a specific time and that'll give you a specific answer. Well, if you're an astrologer worth your salt, you know at any given time what's ruling the ascendant and where the planets are roughly, right? So if you wait to ask the question at the right time, you can try to influence the answer, right? And of course, that's not how astrology is understood to work. That's when you would do the ritual, if you were a magician, to get your cow back, right? But so horary astrology has got this problem where if I'm not going to, since I know where the stars are right now, if I ask the question now and cast a chart for it, I already know what the answer is going to be, right? And so if I wait to ask the question, then I might not. And so this gets really complicated if you have to ask a question you're interested in, right?
Right.
As the astrologer. So geomancy solves that problem because it's going to cast you an astrological chart that you had no knowledge of, right? And understanding the way the divine influences, again, this is the medieval European worldview, but the way the divine influenced the creation of that chart would give you an answer and give you confidence to do that, right? So that's, excuse me, That's one of the problems that existed in medieval Europe, and this is the solution they came up with it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Are there lots of people who practice it? Like,
I shouldn't.
I found you. So, do we know?
Short answer is there's lots of people who are going to have read about it, and there's lots of people who are going to have tried it. How so? I mentioned the essay on geomancy by Agrippa is in the appendices for the 3 books of occult philosophy, the main one that you buy. All of this stuff is out there, and it's referenced by lots of other sources, even just in passing where they don't explain it, right? And you can go out there and you can Google and you can find a lot of this information paired with some misinformation, right? Where it's like they found a gap and they didn't have an answer, so they stuck their own explanation in, right? And I work really hard not to do that and to point to a source or to a philosophical or magical reasoning why people at this time and place would have probably done it this way, right? And so, one of the things, just so criticism of Greer, right? He talks about an outer element versus an inner element.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really curious where he gets those from. And he doesn't ever explain it. So I talked about in the last video how you look at the activation of the elements based on where the single versus dual dots are. So which line has the active dots, those are the active elements, right? He doesn't really talk about that. And then Agrippa gives a way of finding the elements based on the planets that's associated with them, or that's based on the sign associated with them. But based on what I saw, anyway, I couldn't get either of those methods from Agrippa to match up with what Greer does. And I did my criticism of Greer, a while ago. So I'm going just off of memory here. So you can find, if you just Google geomancy or geomancy readings, you can find all kinds of information out there of people doing it. It's not well known, so it's not popular. So very few people advertise that as their main service, right? So you'll see it as a service that a lot of people will offer, but it's not listed as their primary service.
Okay. So, okay.
So the short answer is yes, people are definitely still practicing it. How they are practicing it has varied a lot. And I talk about it. I know I project like I am an authority on this, and I am not. This is like what I can, but I'm confident in what I say because I can point to the historical sources to back up my explanation, right?
Got it.
And so that is not meant to denigrate anybody out there. Now, I say that's in the English-speaking world. In the Arabic-speaking world, this is very much still practiced in different countries. It depends on the country. My understanding, and of course, being an American, I don't have much exposure to it, but in Iran in particular, there is like a tradition where you learn this as part of your family tradition, right? And so I know, but that version that they're going to be practicing over there is going to have been divorced from a lot of the medieval European ways that we developed it on our side. So again, this gets into the cultural appropriation because I don't want to say, I want to say geomancy is one of those things that's practiced by multiple cultures at this point. And this is our connection to it as far as being those of us who came from a European background.
Right. Okay. Cool. That is all my questions for now. Thank you. It was good.
Okay, so we'll just talk briefly about next week. So homework again, same homework, perform another divination you're willing to share with the instructor. If you can share it with the whole class, the better. What I would like to do is have someone at the beginning of next session be willing to share their chart and their interpretation and what they got right and what they got wrong. No one is, as I mentioned, I'm not going to be grading these. No one is expecting you to have anything 100% right. but to be open and to help everybody learn and to have some of those discussions and get that kind of engaged. The next lesson will be next week as an astrological primer. And so we'll be talking, digging a lot more into astrology as it was understood in medieval Europe. And I'll answer some of those questions. I'll go through, I know I reference it, but I'll go through this week and I'll expand out the sections on the intelligences and stuff like that to try to answer some of the questions that I think you have. And because I may reword that from astrological primer to like just magical primer for the medieval European mindset, something like that.
Okay. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And then time-wise, this time works for me. Everybody said it worked for them, and then we had very few people show up, so we'll see what happens.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's also July 4th weekend in the States, so anything is possible.
Oh gosh, that's right. Oh shoot. Actually, pin in the time. I have a party the night before, and we may move it later again because I will probably have a drink at that party, and I don't want to have to be here through one bloodshot eye trying to teach a class. So we'll see what happens.
Sounds good. I'm open.
All right. Well, thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed the lesson, and we'll touch base.
And I'll see you next week.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.